Thank you very much for this nice introduction. Too nice. It's always a pleasure to be here with friends, and it is a nice appointment that every year comes to in the beginning of July or late June, and I'm very pleased. Now, today we're going to talk about sleep apnea and cancer, and that stems from a chapter we wrote for a book that's Sleep and Cancer that will come out on August 1st. It's an all-Italian expert editorial effort, but it is the first book on sleep and cancer ever produced by Elsevier, together with Isolde and Sofia, and also Isaac Almendros, who is a biologist, a PhD professor of physiology, I think, at the University of Barcelona, and who started the experiments actually on sleep apnea, on intermittent hypoxia and cancer. So we wrote this chapter, and so I'm going to present you a short summary of what we found. It's an extensive review of the literature. So we will go through the epidemiological and clinical studies. Then we will ask whether there is evidence on effects of sleep apnea on cancer course or prognosis. Then the story of Philips ventilators, so the possibility that CPAP may cause cancer, and some hints coming from experimental studies. Now, in epidemiological and clinical studies, there are problems in assessing the relationship between sleep apnea and cancer because they are both common diseases and require a long term to develop. So it is very hard to assess any cause-effect relationship. Then, the longitudinal studies we have, the epidemiological studies, were not designed to address the issue of cancer. So there could be the possibility of failure in data recording or reporting, so probably an under-reporting of the cases. Then sleep apnea diagnosis is often self-reported, so there are no data on sleep apnea severity or treatment, so we do not have many data on, at least in the initial studies. Now things are improving on the relationship between the dose of sleep apnea, so the sleep apnea severity, and the effect cancer. But cancer, it's one word, and the first studies also looked at all-cause cancer, but cancer is many cancer types, and also of each cancer site, we have different types of cancer. So let's think about lung cancer, for example. So we say, again, two words, but there are very different types. And so that we lack granularity in assessing the effects of sleep apnea on specific cancer locations or pathology, meaning that we have very general data still, except maybe for the melanoma story. Also, many risk factors for cancer, such as lifestyle or socioeconomic status or obesity, were not considered in the first longitudinal studies. So now the situation is going better because we have stronger, better designed studies, but we're still far from having clear responses on this. And also, we have very few data on CPAP treatment. So let's start. We have 7 meta-analyses already published since between 2015 and 2023, and most of them report an increased risk of cancer associated with HI. And there are some who find a higher risk in patients who are older and women. Then there is only one meta-analysis that addressed the association with nocturnal hypoxemia, but there is also one negative meta-analysis. If we go to large cohorts, then you see that we have slightly more studies reporting an increased risk of cancer, and some of them are quite recent. But there is also a bunch of studies showing no increased risk of cancer. And this is also for recent studies. And it is interesting because there are authors that reported papers with both positive and negative results. For example, Kanzerska in 2014 did not find any positive relationship, but in the study of 2021 she did. And the same is true for Silla with a negative study in 2022 and a positive study in 2018. So the picture is far from being clarified. This is a nice and recent study on a large number of patients, and you see that the probability of developing cancer is highest in those with severe cancer. This is a probability of cancer-free, so the pink is severe sleep apnea. And they also tried to identify possible markers of cancer risk, and they came up with endostatin and BCAM1. But these are very recent data that need replication. Then there are studies in large cohorts, and so there are some studies reporting increased risk of cancer in young sleep apnea patients, in women, but there are a lot of studies showing increased incidence of cancer associated more with nocturnal hypoxemia than HI. And these are increasing in number also because of the fashionable hypoxic burden story. So it is expected. But definitely hypoxia is a risk factor for cancer. And actually, it may be a factor for which cancers are thriving in hypoxia. So it is a factor of positive selection. So those cancer who resist to hypoxia have higher probability of developing than those who are sensitive to hypoxia. So it is also a selective pressure. This summarizes a very big literature that we report in the chapter, in which we try to understand the relationship for single cancer types. So for the lung cancer, the intermittent hypoxia, the evidence is, this is our arbitrary plus and minus I put. So I believe there is quite some evidence showing some relationship between intermittent hypoxia and lung cancer, both in terms of incidence of cancer and also in terms of aggressiveness. Breast has a similar level of evidence, but no increased aggressiveness has been shown associated with intermittent hypoxia or sleep apnea. The best type of cancer studied is melanoma. Why? Because the first experiment that Isaac Almendros did, I was in Barcelona when he did those studies, were done with melanoma implanted in mice undergoing intermittent hypoxia. And this was chosen because the black cells of melanoma were easy to look at in the animal. So it was macroscopic finding, but it turned out that melanoma is actually very sensitive to intermittent hypoxia. And then they developed a lot of experimental studies and also clinical studies. So it is from bench to bedside, and it is the only cancer type that has been thoroughly studied. Then there are very few studies in all other types of cancer, even common ones like colorectal, prostate, or kidney, not to talk about those in central nervous system. So does sleep apnea affect cancer course and or prognosis? That's a major question, because if it doesn't, who cares? Clinically, wouldn't matter. These are studies, very nice. Here, it's shown an increased mortality, cancer-specific mortality, associated with occurrence of nocturnal hypoxemia and also sleep fragmentation. And the same author, she's an epidemiologist from Canada, looked at the different phenotypes described by Zinchuk, the polysomnographic phenotypes, and she found that the survival is lowest for those who have in pink the severe oxygen desaturation, but again the occurrence of periodic leg movements was also importantly associated with poor prognosis, as in the original study by Zinchuk. And in terms of incidence, cumulative incidence, this was confirmed. So PLM and severe oxygen desaturation were these two, well, the highest lines. This looks like a complicated study, but I'll try to explain it to you. So it's a small study in patients with obesity hypoventilation syndrome, and they collected exosomes, so small vesicles containing different substances circulating. And so they looked at the effects of these exosomes on lung cancer cells. The exosomes were taken from the same patients at baseline, so no treatment, and after 3, 12, and 24 months of CPAP treatment with good adherence. And I think the figure really show quite well that cell proliferation, cell migration, and cell invasion of the in vitro model all decreased when exposed to exosomes derived from patients well treated with CPAP. So it means that sleep disorder breathing would favor the occurrence of bad features of cancer, but if you treat the sleep apnea or obesity hypoventilation syndrome, then these features would decrease. And this is probably linked with the inflammatory milieu of the obesity hypoventilation syndrome, and by extension also to obstructive sleep apnea. But there are also clinical data showing that this is not true, because if you look at patients adherent and non-adherent, this is from the Pays de la Loire study, you see that there is not very much difference, no significant difference between incidence of cancer in patients adherent and non-adherent. So it doesn't reach significance. And you see here the lung maybe might show a small trend for a worse incidence, a higher incidence in those non-adherent. But of course, the numbers, even in big series of patients, are really small if you go to the granularity of different cancer types. So there are just few patients to get significant results. Instead, in the melanoma study, the Spanish sleep court did a study on a big group of melanoma patients. They put them on CPAP, and so they, after 5 years, they looked at those without sleep apnea at the beginning, and those with good compliance to CPAP, and those with mild, moderate, and severe sleep apnea, insufficiently or not treated, and looked at recurrence of melanoma or metastasis or death. And the results show that those treated with CPAP did not have any significant independent effect of, so the CPAP was fine, whereas an increased risk was for those, and it showed also a dose response effect, because you see between 11 and 29 without CPAP had an increased risk, 2.5, but the risk was almost 3 for those with an AHI higher than 30 events without CPAP. Of course, there are also other risk factors depending on the melanoma cell properties, like Breslow index, like the sentinel lymph node, or lack of chemotherapy. So there are other factors, but this certainly suggests that sleep apnea is no good if you have melanoma also. And then there is the story of Philips ventilator. So there was the hypothesis that the foam from the Philips ventilator, released from the Philips ventilator, might cause cancer. And indeed, this study shows that the report of cancers were really big after 2021. So there was a jump in this file, in this database, where people can report the side effects. And the side effects increased after 2021 when there was this announcement by Philips. But the large part, so 91.15%, 91.5% of patients, no, it's wrong. 91% of patients with degradation of the foam had no cancer. It was only 1 in 10 that actually reported cancer. So this was an important issue to solve. And indeed, in the Pays de la Loire cohort, they actually compared the incidence of cancer in those using Philips Respironic devices and those not using Philips Respironic devices. And the difference, as you see, is non-significant. So it doesn't matter. So it was not due to so there was no difference. There was no special issue with Philips Respironics and this foam degrading story. And similarly, this is another study in Ontario. They did find in the unadjusted analysis that there was an increased risk, but then when they adjusted it for many factors, then many confounders, then the difference became non-significant. So Gagnadou did write this editorial and summarize the studies available. There was the first one, there was no association. The other one found a higher all-cause cancer incidence, but this was due to a county in Sweden where there was a very high percentage of smokers, so it was not really reliable. Then Justo found no association, and the last paper I've shown you found a higher cancer rate in the recall group, but there was no statistical difference after correction. So he concluded that we probably should not be concerned about the Philips story, up to now, at least. Then a fast look at the experimental studies. This is the complex relationship. We're not going through this figure that was considered by the authors, the editors of the book. Then after this, they decided to make a book on cancer and sleep disorders. And you see, it's a very complex picture with a lot of factors. And one thing I find really interesting is the effect of clock genes and the circadian rhythm, because it turns out, and this is a new avenue of cancer treatment, because it could be that treatment respecting the circadian changes might be more effective. And so you see that there are circulating tumor cells that peak during the rest phase. So they're, according to the different clusters, whether they are just tumor cells or neutrophil cluster or fibroblast cluster, their capacity of cause metastasis increase. So this is a very important aspect in cancer biology that was overlooked before. This is a very schematic but still valid picture summarizing how sleep apnea could affect cancer through the intermediate mechanism, including hypoxic EF factors, radical oxygen species, oxidative stress, inflammation, immune deregulation, all things that we know occur in sleep apnea and that can potentially aggravate or cause cancer. But even the intermittent hypoxia stimulus is very complex. It's largely used in cancer literature, but many intermittent hypoxia protocols include longer spells of hypoxia than the intermittent hypoxia cycle that is typically short in sleep apnea. So and also different cancer types have a variable sensitivity to intermittent hypoxia. So again, it is like a lot of information that is not that's hard to reconcile for what the clinical reality is. And for example, this is a small but very important study from the Spanish group, from Isaac Almendro's group. He tested the different patterns of intermittent hypoxia exposure or sustained hypoxia in 4 different lung cancer lines. And you see visually that the response changes according to the cancer type. And so there is an heterogeneity that does not allow to make simpler arrows going from sleep apnea or intermittent hypoxia to cancer. And there is also the issue of obesity, because obesity has been considered a risk factor for sleep apnea, but no, obesity has been considered a risk factor for cancer, but in those studies, sleep apnea was not considered. So we do not know whether it was sleep apnea or obesity. And there is the obesity paradox. So obese people do better than non-obese for some things. The adipose tissue distribution is also important instead of BMI. Obesity also causes tissue hypoxia, so the obese adipose tissue is often hypoxic, and so it is a superimposition of intermittent on top of continuous hypoxia in adipose tissue. And also intermittent hypoxia promoted melanoma progression in lean but not obese mice. And there are also data in humans similar, I'll show you. And there is this important extracellular matrix remodeling caused by obesity that is relevant because it allows malignant cells to go through tissue more easily and metastasize more easily. So this is the human study. And also in patients with melanoma, you see that there is a sort of ceiling effect caused by intermittent hypoxia in lean people, so that if they have high leptin levels, there is no increase in TGF-beta levels in obese patients with sleep apnea and melanoma. So it appears that the obesity is not doing that much. So this is very complicated. There are lots of different mediators that have been studied, and you see that many are linked with intermittent hypoxia-mediated upregulation, and so intermittent hypoxia is still a major suspect. And but even melanoma cells, just briefly, will not go through the entire figure for reasons of time. You see that different cell lines of melanoma respond differently. Just visually, you see that it is not the same behavior. So again, proliferation and migration, so aspects of aggressiveness of cancer are very hard to study. And this is the picture of the genes of the 2 lines of melanoma. So we are still at the very beginning of this story. But one important issue is that sleep apnea does decrease our defenses, immunological defenses. So if the PD-L1, soluble PD-L1 increases, this is a marker of aggressiveness of melanoma, at least. So we start having some markers that could be used in clinical practice. But this is the effects of sleep apnea in blue, and the sites at the different chromosomes interested by different cancers. So you can see that it is really hard. We are still really far from understanding the biology of different cancer types in relation with the sleep apnea. So in conclusion, we can say that epidemiological studies do suggest a positive relationship between sleep apnea and cancer. There is also biological plausibility. So intermittent hypoxia does increase cancer development, aggressiveness, and prognosis, at least in melanoma. We do not have enough data for different types of cancer, for many cancer sites. Again, melanoma is the one studied best, but it's also a special tumor, and it is also in young people. So it is very different from, for example, lung or breast cancer, but lung cancer is growing in interest because of its, I think, closeness to the respiratory field, but also to the fact that it is a main killer, still a main killer in the world. So interesting aspects, I think, is circadian rhythms. This is very nice. Or the protection against cancer by CPAP treatment. This is information that we badly need. And to date, there is no evidence that CPAP machines release factors detrimental for health that increase cancer risk. Thank you very much for your attention.